Thank you, Clive, for that introduction. And thank you also to Landmark for inviting me along today to give a talk on what is essentially quite a complex subject. A couple of bits of housekeeping first. Although I do represent EIC and the EIC Clare Joint Industry Working Group, or JIG, as I refer to it in my talk, any views that I express today or any jokes are my own. It's been an interesting day so far, and I hope to be able to add some value to that by giving you an insight into progress, essentially more or less 1 year on to the day from a whole day conference that was held in Manchester on the issue of asbestos in soil, made ground and C&D waste. And at that event we had in excess of 250 people attend. It was a complete sellout for weeks and weeks in advance. So just to give you an indication, I'm not intending on delivering a masterclass on the topic today, but really just an overview of some of the key issues on where we're going. I wonder, before I move on, if I could just have a quick show of hands. Who in the audience comes across asbestos in soil, made ground or C&D wastes in their routine day-to-day, and how significant an issue is that for them? Probably getting on for a half or so, maybe a bit more. Fantastic. To start, keeping in line with earlier presentations, here's some witty advice on risk management by Warren Buffett. Risk comes from not knowing what you're doing. I think fairly self-explanatory. I did have a look in the records of the 1980s teen flick movie with Tom Cruise of the same name, Risky Business, but was unable to find any appropriate or relevant quotations there, I'm afraid. In the context of my talk today, really, as Clive said in the introduction there, uncertainty leads to significant risk. And in the context of my talk, we're looking to focus on commercial and compliance risks. And ultimately, hopefully, we'll give you an insight into where things are going and how they're being addressed by the JIG moving forward. An overview of my talk, briefly, an outline of the historical context, touching on items related to commercial risk and compliance risk. I must stress that I'm not going to touch at all on human health risk assessment. That's for a day in itself, I think. I'll give you an outline of progress with the JIG Code of Practice Practitioner's Guide and how that's developing. Specifically, highlight on the key issues review that are currently being undertaken by the JIG membership. And I'll give you a brief update on ongoing discussions with the Environment Agency and the Health and Safety Executive on regulation and enforcement among some of the key issues that are relevant to this topic. I must stress that I've put DEFRA and DFT in brackets. It's hoped that they will engage with us in this process, but we've yet to make contact with the relevant people to move that forward. So briefly, in terms of legislation or guidance, ICRCL on asbestos came out in 1985. Second edition was published in 1990, and I thought it hadn't been withdrawn. I know Phil mentioned earlier that it had been withdrawn. I thought that this was still relevant and the most relevant current guidance that we've got available to us now. That guidance was updated following some research that was carried out by the Institute of Occupational Medicine to look at how fibres could be dispersed from soils and made ground and the concentrations of those fibres. And subsequent to that, in the mid-90s, HSE produced a further research document which looked at how we could effectively characterise soils and loose aggregates for free fibres, as well as asbestos-containing materials. We were long promised by DEFRA and the Environment Agency some long-awaited guidance on asbestos in soil. It was promoted as being up for a soil guideline value. That research was started, was ultimately shelved in 2010. And I think going back now to around about mid-2010 was when this discussion first emerged within the EIC's Contaminated Land Working Group, where the issue was raised in the context of, well, this is the biggest thing potentially in the last 30 years that we've missed and that we continue to not address adequately. So in essence, this has become a hot topic over the last 2.5 years, and we're still plodding on with it. So in terms of a couple of the key issues on commercial risk, the first thing I'd say is, as a practitioner, it's absolutely not a level playing field. Not a level playing field when you're bidding for work, whether in the public sector or the private sector, and it's absolutely not a level playing field. In fact, it's a bit of a postcode lottery when you're communicating with regulators up and down the country in terms of what they will and what they will not allow you as a contractor to do in order to remediate a site contaminated with asbestos or to reduce the risk. So that's a very, very fundamental key issue. Another quote, forgive me, Paul, for bringing this up, but as you once said, get it wrong, it costs a lot. I think that sums it up quite well. Principally in terms of the potential claims that could come at you for not adequately addressing the issue. And I know it's difficult because we're all waiting for guidance, but there is some guidance out there that's issued in respect to asbestos in soil. There is a lot of guidance that's issued with respect to compliance with the control of asbestos regulations. And as we move forward through the course of the rest of this year and into 2013, that there will be a lot of events, a lot of seminars, webinars and so on, which will be further highlighting the issue. So people need to get with the programme and understand the potential pitfalls of getting it wrong. Civil damages there, that's something that could potentially come at you, 20, 30, 40 years down the line, as a couple of parties found out recently following some judgments in the Supreme Court. So we're not just thinking about short-term impact, we're talking about long-term legacy issues. You have to ensure that any subcontractors you employ are adequately covered in terms of insurance as well as yourself. It might strike you as unusual, but even some of the major UK remediation contractors have been found lacking in their insurance cover, with asbestos being specifically excluded. And unless it's specifically included, you're not covered. So if there's any one thing you want to do when you go away today is to check your cover to make sure that you are covered for all things asbestos. In terms of compliance risk, training and competence, really two issues of paramount importance, and I think there it's important to stress that one must, as in all professional positions and walks of life, recognise your limitations. There's no point dabbling with asbestos. If you haven't got the right technical skills, experience and competence, then it's incumbent upon you to employ either staff who've got the right mix of skills and experience or an appropriate subcontractor. Now, as an absolute minimum, as an employer, if you're requiring any staff to carry out work with asbestos, both your staff and management should have, as a minimum, appropriate training. And that appropriate training is asbestos awareness, and that's required by Regulation 10 of the Control of Asbestos Regulations, 2012. And those regulations and accompanying guidance set out what needs to be in that training. And this training is to be delivered annually. It needs to be task specific. So your training needs analysis, needs to reflect what your staff's duties are and their responsibilities. And if you're in a management role, you need to make pretty well sure that you fully understand all of the issues so that you can task those staff appropriately. The British Occupational Hygiene Society have a suite of what's called P-certs, preliminary certificates in occupational hygiene, for asbestos management activities. Now, those aren't specifically relevant to investigating and assessing soil contamination. But just a watchword here is that the BOHS will be, in fact, are in the process of developing several asbestos in soil specific P-certs, so they'll be coming online at some point in the future. In terms of waste legislation and guidance, this is another big area that one could be exposed to non-compliance. The CLARE Development Industry Definition of Waste Code of Practice, I think is a very, very useful document, and ultimately the JIG Code of Practice will be based on the principles espoused in that document. But I think that the framework provided in that Code of Practice for qualified persons, as they're known, is a very useful starting point, and we must understand that any technical proficiency training and skills development that we carry out for asbestos in soil should enable qualified persons to fulfill their duties under the Waste Code of Practice. Compliance risk, again, HSE prosecution. They're not averse to prosecuting, very litigious, the HSE. In terms of asbestos, they've got a range of acts and regulations against which they can launch a prosecution, whether it be the Health and Safety at Work Act, through to the CDM regulations or the Control of Asbestos regulations. In fact, it has been known for them to prosecute under relevant regs of all three of those instruments. The Environment Agency, they're increasing their activity in the waste sector with the Waste Crimes Unit, particularly looking to recover under the Proceeds of Crime Act in respect of infringements of waste legislation. And again, it's worth pointing out that the HSE, now they've introduced fee for intervention. They're more inclined to be looking at high-risk sectors, and the waste sector is one of those so-called high-risk sectors. So you know, the potential prosecution landscape is getting darker for practitioners. Here's an example. I thought, whilst it doesn't relate to asbestos in soil, it'd be worthwhile putting up there just to show what can and is being done by the HSE. Two subcontractors were exposed to asbestos fibres at Reading University. They were asked to go in and drill through a slab, installing services. Unfortunately, they drilled through sprayed asbestos coating. Now, it turns out that they were employed by a subcontractor of the principal contractor who'd been provided with an asbestos survey. Unfortunately, that survey or that information wasn't communicated effectively to the subcontractor and his subcontractors. And as a result, the principal contractor pleaded guilty to breaching Regulation 11 of CAR 2006, the old regs, as well as Reg 23 of the CDM regs, and they were fined and were required to pay costs in excess of 50k. The web link is there for you to look up that and other recent prosecutions. And that one, incidentally, was published on the 8th of October, just gone. So HSE are very, very active. And I think in the light of the move now to highlight issues regarding asbestos in soil and waste, I think we potentially only see their activity increasing in our own sector. However, guidance is evolving to reduce those risks. The AGS recently published interim guidance on protection of staff when engaged in activities surrounding the investigation and analysis in the laboratory of materials contaminated or potentially contaminated with asbestos. That's freely available to download off the AGS website. Syria are in the process of finalising their guide to managing and understanding the risks of asbestos in soil and in brownfield sites. And the last I heard, that's due to be finalised by the end of this year. The Health and Safety Executive, I think it's fair to say, under pressure from other sectors, have finally realised that they need to introduce some definitive guidance supporting the legislation on asbestos in soil, and as a result formed a task group under the Committee for Fibre Measurement, Working Group 2, to look specifically at asbestos in soil with a focus on worker protection, because environment isn't within the HSE's remit. And that's looking to finalise guidance by November next year. United Kingdom Accreditation Service, they've long been planning, following my visit there back in July 2010, to form a working group. That's now looking to start its work in January 2013 with a specific remit, I believe, to flesh out all of the issues related to accreditation for testing of asbestos in soil. And then we've got the EIC Clare JIG Code of Practice. It's actually technically called Asbestos in Soil, Made Ground and Construction and Demolition Waste, but believe me, we agonised long and hard over the precise title. That occupied our minds for quite some time. And I think that reflects the mix of materials which we want to work with. There's a brief schematic. Not quite come out right on the screen there, but it serves to illustrate the process by which we're aiming to output the Code of Practice. So in the yellow box, we've got an ongoing regulatory enforcement policy development dialogue with EA and HSE and the departments I mentioned earlier, in order to provide clarification on some of the key issues related to regulation, and to provide a unified approach across the country. And when I say the country, specifically England, but other devolved administrations. And that's looking to feed into the development of robust policy and guidance to underpin the legislation. You know, that might actually be the harder thing to achieve at the end of the day, but we felt it was imperative to get that sound footing before we move forward with the guidance. We're actually in the process of finalising a statement. I was hopeful that we'd have it ready to communicate to you today, setting out how the EA and the HSE are working with the JIG in order to set out the key principles. But as is with all of these things, regulatory and agency, it's taking a little bit longer than anticipated. So that will be posted soon on the Clare website, so you can all have a look at that, get a better understanding of where we're going. So to say a couple of things about the JIG Code of Practice, it's very much industry-led and funded, but crucially has ministerial support, specifically from ministers in DEFRA and the Department for Work and Pensions, the sponsoring department for the HSE, and also critically has regulator input and ultimately will have endorsement from the regulators. I'll stress it's founded on the clarification of the key regulatory enforcement issues and principles with the EA and the HSE, as well as DEFRA and DFT. We're going through an extensive stakeholder engagement process because at the end of the day, if we're going to have a code of practice that's going to be universally accepted by regulator, public sector and private sector alike, it needs to be fit for purpose. So we're very keen to scope out all the issues and formulate an approach that's going to be accepted by all. The way that the Code of Practice is going to be written is by a number of authors who will be selected to work in teams to provide output to a brief that will be set by the JIG committee. We're talking about leading industry experts and practitioners from both asbestos and contaminated land sectors. Recently, Claire sent out an expression of interest and to date, I believe, we've had about 40 or so returned. There will be other people who will be approached directly that may not have already submitted a return, where we feel that their input will be useful. There's the membership list of the JIG steering group. Rick's at the bottom right. We're in the process of contacting them to see if they want to be involved. But if we've achieved one thing today, I think it's absolutely fantastic that we've managed to get not just the EIC in Syria around the same table, but the EA, the Health and Safety Executive, the Health and Safety Laboratory, as well as industry practitioners from the brownfield and the asbestos sectors. I mean, part of the reason we are where we are now is because the issue of asbestos in soil has fallen between two stools. The agency has said, well, it's asbestos, that's your bag, HSE, and the HSE said, well, it's in the soil, so that's your bag, and nothing's quite moved forward as fast as it could have done. So it's most encouraging that we've got such a widespread makeup on the committee. In terms of the programme, we're aiming to complete a detailed specification by the end of the year. The programme's been delayed by at least 3 months because we're quite keen to tie in to what's being developed by Syria. The two projects ultimately will be synergistic so that we avoid repetition and we're all dealing with the same concepts and principles, albeit different format. The work itself will undergo extensive peer review and editing, so we'll be looking at going out to not only members of the JIG steering committee, but the wider industry, as well as the regulators have expressed a keen interest to ensure that they actively participate in that process. When it's ready, it'll go out for extensive public consultation. Again, we want as many people to comment and feedback on this as possible so that we engender widespread acceptance. We're looking now at the end of 2013, which ties in with HSE's review of guidance and their codes of practice. The document itself will be free to download and will be supported by a training package so that everyone who's quite keen to ensure that their skill level comes up can understand the implications of the code of practice in their everyday work. For more details, all of the minutes from the meetings, not just of the JIG, but also the meetings with the HSE and the Environment Agency are available to download from the CLARE website. Please visit that for further information. It'd be remiss of me not to highlight there are still some sponsoring opportunities available. If your company's prepared to put some money in. I'm not dealing with that personally. Speak to Nicola Harris at CLARE. That's her email address if you want to get in touch with her. Right now, to move the issue forward, we're actually looking at some key issues. Investigation and monitoring, laboratory analysis, human health risk assessment, waste management, and the regulations, both control of asbestos regs and environmental protection, environmental permitting regs 2010, as well as a root and branch review of asbestos work categories so that we can understand better what is licensed and unlicensed work. In terms of the development dialogue, I need to run through these fairly quickly, but we're trying to thrash out some of the key issues on control of asbestos regs and licensing to avoid conflicts between environmental permitting regs and the control of asbestos regulations. That's ongoing. This is what the HSE call their rainbow diagram. This reflects different work categories. The red end, licensable work, the bottom blue end, non-licensed work, and in the middle it's the grey area for site-specific assessment. We're looking at firming up on that in the context of soil and demolition waste. Definition of asbestos is one of the key areas. At the minute, asbestos is anything with greater than trace levels of asbestos fibres, and that definition is provided in HSG 248. And the control of asbestos regs applies to all work on those materials. So we need to look at how we might practically redefine that. The regs apply to all work which is liable to disturb asbestos-containing materials, but clearing of contaminated land with asbestos isn't specifically covered. We've got an opportunity to feed into the review of HSE's ACOP, which they'll be consulting on hopefully sometime in the middle of next year. CAR 2012 applies to surveying of asbestos, but not specifically contaminated land, although there is a requirement to apply those regs to land on premises, including underground structures. So there's a bit of a conflict there. We need to thrash out with the HSC the implications of Regulation 4 and Regulation 5 of CAR. In terms of soil, this is still a big issue. There's very few laboratories, a handful of laboratories that are accredited for mass quantification. UCAS require now that you need to undertake analysis of samples for asbestos materials and free fibres, whereas before screening of bulk asbestos materials was acceptable. The current methodology that's used isn't designed to answer all the questions we might want to ask in relation to asbestos in soil and redevelopment. So we'll be looking at that, possibly in the context of the development of a Blue Book method. Waste definitions. The waste catalogue says that greater than 0.1% asbestos is hazardous in those types of materials. However, it's becoming increasingly clear that the Environment Agency might wish to consider anything that's got less than 0.1%, if it's visible, is also hazardous waste. And this is potentially a big issue for the industry, which might consign many, many thousands of tons of material to landfill disposal on the basis of very low-risk materials. In terms of permitting, the agency require a mobile plant for remediation, where a mobile plant is used, but there appears to be some conflicts with other operations, notably T5 and T7 exemption. Hand-picking on one occasion was told to me as being a mobile plant activity which required a permit, which isn't strictly true. So we need to understand what processes we can use to effectively remediate and by whom to allow effective reuse of material where appropriate. We also need to look at the balance of hazard and risk. It's somewhat ironic that we can have material that's technically hazardous waste that's very low risk, and we can have non-hazardous waste which is very high potential risk because of its free fibre content. So we need to figure out how to square the circle there. In terms of resource recovery, well, clear definition of waste code of practice prescribes that we don't cause harm to the environment or human health. We encourage sustainability. We want to build on those principles, better understand the meaning of what no asbestos means in practical terms, given widespread asbestos contamination around the country, and how to demonstrate asbestos is in fact present at acceptable levels. As a society, we need to define what is acceptable in the context of risk. We need to understand, is it possible to develop the code of practice there for direct transfer of material contaminated with asbestos? And currently that's not possible, but it might be something that's desirable. The RAP protocol, I think we need to roll that in as well. A couple of issues here in closing, which again we could spend a long time discussing. Asbestos prohibitions and REACH. We want to engage with DEFRA on that to look at how European Chemical Hazard Agency guidance can be clarified. And we also need to understand the significant implications of currently required compliance with the carriage of dangerous goods regulations in terms of packaging, consignment, and so on. So in summary, we've got a significant uncertainty from inconsistent application of regulations and lack of robust practical guidance. That equals commercial and compliance risks. We have got government and regulator support for industry-wide initiative to develop comprehensive guidance, to reduce uncertainty and consequent risks in the spirit of better regulation. And lastly there, we've got the EIC CLARE Code of Practice, which will be based on clear and consistent regulatory enforcement positions, synergistic with other complementary guidance. And just in closing, I'll point out that on one of the tables, the right-hand table, the landmark table in the room next door, we've got a couple of samples. 3 samples in the large Petri dishes all contain 0.1% asbestos of different types. See if you can tell just by looking. And there's 1 sample of raw asbestos insulation, 0.1 gram of amosite. I think you'll all be surprised at what you see. Thank you for listening, and thank you, Clive, for your patience.
Thank you, Steve.